So this week I'm talking about who are the greatest art forgers, and that title, Greatest Art Forger, is one that all the art forgers who've been exposed seems to want to acquire for themselves. I think it's because the title, Greatest Art Forger, brings book deals, television programs, and makes it easier for them to sell their own work at a high price. This work here, you might be wondering, is it a Matisse or a forgery? Well, it's one of the works that I'll be talking about later. And having said that, having mentioned the greatest art forgers, I guess the greatest art forgers must be those that we've never heard of, those that have forged so well that they've never been detected. So back through history, there's probably thousands of such people, such forgers whose names are lost. And I'm going to talk on just the forgers of the last 100 years. But before I do, I would like to briefly try to summarize the history of forgery to put it in some sort of perspective. This is Lely's Venus, and it's making the point that copying famous artists goes back to the earliest days, to the classical period. And this is a late Roman copy of a Greek Hellenistic original of Aphrodite. And many have been found in this pose. It was obviously very popular. So why did the Romans copy the Greeks? They both imported from Greece and also employed Greek sculptors in Italy, and also Romans learnt the trade. Why did they think the Greeks were so good? And did that bother them? Well, not really, because they didn't regard it as a manly quality. What the Romans valued was bravery, valor, toughness, and so on, rather than artistic ability. But they did like the art, they did like the statues, but they had no problem buying from the Greek originals, and they regarded the Greeks as the experts. Incidentally, before I go on, just to point out, looking at this statue, that remember that all ancient, as far as we know now, all ancient sculptures, Greek and Roman, were brightly coloured with lifelike details. Skin coloured, eyes painted in, eyelashes painted on, hair coloured. The band across her hair would have been a bright colour. Difficult for us to understand now because we like the plain white marble, but I think it goes back to the Renaissance. As these statues were being dug up in Italy, they had become white over time, and that became regarded as an example of the purity of these classical sculptures, and it became associated with them. So now, even today, thinking of these being in bright colors is detracts from them, but obviously not in the original. The other thing to bear in mind is that the Romans did value certain Greek sculptors above others. So Phidias, for example, was regarded as one of the greatest sculptors of all time, and he was often imitated. So it's inevitable that some of the Greek sculptures imported into Rome were claimed to be by some of the famous Greek sculptors, Polykleitos, Phidias, Praxiteles, Myron, and so on. And in other words, forgeries. And forgeries has always been with us. Dürer's work, leaping on over 1,000 years, was frequently forged, and he brought the first art-specific lawsuit against a forger. He brought the art suit in Venice, and he actually won the case against Marc Antonio Raimondi, and Raimondi was allowed by the court to continue copying Dürer's work as long as he didn't use his monogram. It's down there, AD, Albrecht Dürer, because that was seen to be passing off his work as Dürer. But if he didn't put the monogram on the work, the court allowed Raimondi to copy the Dürer's work precisely. So it was a partial victory. Let's look now at another Renaissance sculptor who you know very well, but in this case, not copying individual artists, but a rare type of art. In Renaissance Italy, classical sculpture was being dug up, but it was highly valued because it was rare. And also during the Renaissance, artists learnt their craft in large workshops by copying the works of the master. In other words, copying a great artist was a sign of artistic ability, not of fakery. It was the way you learned. Although, of course, that's true today. There's a difference between honest and open copying, and selling a work and claiming it is by an artist other than the one who produced it. Now, when he was 21 in 1496, Michelangelo carved a statue of sleeping Eros. Now, unfortunately, that statue is lost, but this is the type of statue he would have copied. Then, like a good forger, he aged the marble to make it look ancient and sold it. And I think this might have been potentially a big mistake, but he sold it to Cardinal Raphael Riario, who was the grandnephew of the then Pope Sixtus IV. The ruse was discovered, but by the time it was discovered, Michelangelo had carved his famous Pietà, and he'd gone from being unknown to being famous across Rome. So when the fake was discovered, the cardinal returned it to the dealer, but the dealer returned the money. He had no trouble selling it as the work of the now famous Michelangelo. So Michelangelo was lucky. He was also lucky the cardinal wasn't angry about being fooled. In fact, the Cardinal Riario became Michelangelo's first patron in Rome. We don't know why he did it, but maybe his motivation was similar to many artists today, and it's a theme that I'll be coming back to. It's artists who, it's not so much for the money. I mean, it's partly for the money for some of them, but they're annoyed at being unrecognized. They're aware of their skill. They become disdainful of the competence of dealers and buyers, and they create these works to demonstrate their ability, to show their skill, but also to show how incompetent the so-called experts are at judging good art. And we'll come across this motivation again and again. This you might recognize. We've moved on a couple of hundred years. It's the first plate of William Hogarth's The Harlot's Progress. And if you remember that, you'll notice it's reversed. It's a forgery of this. And the forger obviously just copied the original onto a new plate. And then, of course, when you take the print from the plate, if you just copy that, then it'll be reversed. And Hogarth was so angry about the large number of forgeries of his work, not just this one, there were many, that he appealed to members of parliament, some of whom he knew well. And a few years later, in 1735, they passed the Engravers Act, which was the first law to specifically protect artworks. And as a result, Hogarth's efforts, it was, and is still known as the Hogarth Act. So that's a brief overview of the history, basically to show that forgery has been rife throughout history. So who are the well-known forgers of the last 100 years? Well, I've had to select 12, 6 in this talk and 6 next week. And I'm going to deal with them in the order of their birth date. So first, it's Han van Meegeren, then Elmire de Hory, Tom Keating, Eric Hebborn, John Myatt, and Max Brandrett that I'll be talking about this week. So let's get on with it. Just do something technical. Right. Henricus Antonius Meegeren, or Van Meegeren, known as Han van Meegeren, was a Dutch painter and portraitist. And I think his story is in some ways the most exciting, because as a result of his forgery, he came close to being sentenced to life imprisonment, or possibly even a death sentence as a traitor. But instead, he achieved worldwide acclaim and fame. So he's a forger that is probably most often given as an example. This is a photograph of him in his studio in 1945, and behind him a painting that we'll come back to, a very significant work for him, Young Christ in the Temple, it's called. But let me start at the beginning. In his youth, he fell in love with the Dutch Golden Age painting, and he took up painting and painted in a similar style, but the critics found his work derivative, tired, and old-fashioned, and this caused resentment on his part. And like many other forgers, he set out not to make money, or not just to make money, but to show the world his skill and prove the lack of expertise in the art market. So he decided to do this by creating not copies, but new works in the style of the Dutch masters, and his forgeries became accepted as the real thing and highly praised. I'll just give this example. In 1937, he created perhaps his most successful and well-known forgery, Supper at Emmaus, in the style of Vermeer. He painted it when he was in the south of France, and it was accepted as a real Vermeer by the experts. In fact, there was one expert, Abraham Bradius, and he was the most important Dutch art scholar at the time, and he was asked to look at it, and he wrote a long article in praise of it, and I've just extracted one sentence. The masterpiece of Johannes Vermeer of Delft, quite different from all his other paintings, and yet every inch of Vermeer. Of course, this must have pleased Van Meegeren enormously, as it proved how skillful he was and how good he was at fooling even the top experts. I should add that today it's difficult to understand why this was accepted as a Vermeer, as it doesn't to us look like one. However, Van Meegeren presented this as an early undiscovered work by Vermeer, painted during his religious phase. And if you remember in my talk on Vermeer, I included one work from that period, Christ in the House of Martha and Mary, which is an authenticated Vermeer, which he painted when he was 22. And the resemblance of that painting to this one is much closer than a typical late Vermeer. But there was another angle. At the time he painted this, the experts, in particular Bradius, believed Vermeer had travelled to Italy. So Van Meegeren based the design of this work on a painting of the same subject by Caravaggio. Let me show you that work by Caravaggio so you can see what I mean. Now, the Van Meegeren knew that this idea that Vermeer had travelled to Italy was strongly argued by the scholar Bradius, and it was that link to his pet theory of Vermeer travelling to Italy that caught Bradius hook, line and sinker, I think, and that's what create that scholarly link, is why Bradius believe so strongly that this must have been an early work by Vermeer. The other thing to remember is Van Meegeren took enormous trouble. He spent 6 years learning how to create a work that passed all or nearly all the tests of 17th century painting. He bought 17th century canvases, painted, cleaned them of paint, rubbed down all the paint. He bought raw materials, as the artist would have done then, exactly the same materials. He ground them, he mixed his own pigments. He bought badger hair brushes that we know Vermeer used, but he couldn't find a way of hardening the paints to make them look 300 years old, until he discovered that if he used Bakelite, phenyl formaldehyde, it had that effect of hardening the paint. And he mixed the pigments with lilac oil to prevent them fading, and then he baked them as well in an oven at 100 to 120 degrees to further harden the paint. And then he would roll the canvas over a cylinder to crack the canvas, and then he filled the cracks with Indian ink, so it looked like 300 years of embedded dirt. But it was the Bakelite was one of the things that eventually gave him away and possibly saved his life. But that was really a different exercise that saved his life. But let me explain why he was tried. It wasn't for being a forger. He was tried for being a traitor. Now, during the war, he sold another Vermeer that he'd painted, this one, Christ with the woman taken in adultery, to a Nazi art dealer who sold it to Hermann Goering. And then towards the end of the war, Goering hid over 6,000 looted artworks in a salt mine. And after the war, the Allies discovered those works, and they found what they thought was a Vermeer, this one, and Vermeeren was charged with aiding and abetting the enemy, for being a traitor. He was threatened with the death penalty, so he decided to confess and told them he'd painted it, but no one believed him. So he proposed, with the court's agreement, to paint another picture in the style of Vermeer in front of witnesses. So over a 6-month period in 1945, and in the presence of reporters and court-appointed witnesses, he painted his last forgery, which was the one we saw in the photograph, Young Christ in the Temple. He was found guilty of forgery, but he obviously wasn't a traitor. He was transferred to prison, but when the facts came out, they were reported in the press and became a national and then an international hero for fooling the Nazis. He appealed his forgery sentence and was allowed home, but he died before he could be sent to hospital. And there's a final twist, which I quite like for some reason. He filed for bankruptcy, even though everyone knew he'd bought many properties and appeared to be wealthy, but his estate only amounted to, in modern day terms, $60,000, so relatively small. So where did all the money go? Well, the properties and the bulk of his illegal proceeds he'd already transferred to his wife, and then they divorced, although they continued to live together. And throughout the trial, he maintained she had no knowledge of his forgery, and many believed him. And even if they didn't, they couldn't prove that she knew anything about the forgery. So she was allowed to keep the proceeds and lived on the money till the age of 91. And many today consider Van Meegeren, he's often quoted as the greatest forger of the 20th century because of the fame, because of the, he achieved worldwide fame for fooling the Nazis, basically. My second candidate for the greatest forger is Elmir Dehori, a Hungarian forger who sold thousands of forgeries to art galleries around the world. He claimed to be an aristocrat, a Hungarian aristocrat, but later research found that it was a lie, always a danger with the criminal fraternity. His parents were in fact middle class. He was born Elmir Hoffmann, born in Munich to a Jewish family, trained as an artist, found it difficult to sell his work during the Great Depression in the 1930s, was arrested for various minor crimes, not forgery at that stage, just petty theft. During the war, he was arrested as he was Jewish and a homosexual, severely beaten in prison, but when he was sent to hospital, he managed to escape and return to Hungary, although I should point out that historians have not been able to verify this from historic records. They haven't found any written evidence that this happened, so it may, of course, be invented. A couple of works a couple of examples of his forgery, a Picasso on the left and Modigliani on the right. After the war, he went to Paris to earn a living as an artist, but he found he couldn't sell his own work, but he found he could paint in the style of any of the famous painters. And he found that out through a drawing. In 1946, he did a pen and ink drawing in the style of Picasso, and there was a British woman who bought it, thought it was a Picasso. He was in dire financial straits. She offered him a lot of money, and he went along with the ruse. That was the first example. Started with a misunderstanding, but he did it again, and he sold other Picasso works around Paris, claiming that because forgers always need an explanation of how they came upon these works. He claimed he was a displaced Hungarian aristocrat and was selling his family's art collection. Or sometimes he would say that when he was in Paris in the 20s and 30s, which he was, he knew these artists, some of whom he did know, and he acquired the works directly from them. So for the next 20 years, he had no financial problems. And in fact, he later justified these crimes by arguing that his buyers were getting a beautiful picture at a knockdown price, and they thought they were getting an absolute bargain. So everyone was happy. That was his justification. In 1947, he went to Rio de Janeiro, still selling fakes, still painting in his own style and trying to sell his own work, but his own work didn't really sell, but the forgeries did. He then moved to America, where he spent the next 12 years traveling around America from city to city because he didn't want to use the same art dealer too many times. He expanded his forgeries to include Matisse, as you see here, Modigliani, who's often forged, and Renoir. There was an art dealer in Chicago who quickly discovered he'd been sold a fake and pressed charges, and the FBI started to investigate. So he fled to Mexico City. And in Mexico, he was arrested for being involved in the murder of a British man. I don't know whether that was misidentification but the police started to try to extort money from him. And so he appointed a lawyer to defend himself. And then the lawyer tried to extort money from him as well. So he paid, in quotes, the lawyer using one of his forgeries. Sorry, I can't help laughing at this point, and fled back to America. And what he discovered in America is by then, galleries were selling his forgeries for far more than they'd paid him. That's typically the case, particularly if a gallery suspects, they'll pay a small amount of money and then resell it at a large amount of money. it's estimated that something like $50 million worth of Dahori forgeries changed hands. Not that Dahori got all that money. That's what the dealers made. And it's said he could turn out a passable Matisse in about an hour. And it's Matisse forgeries that his name is most often associated with, but he could forge any artist. The galleries, he'd visited so many galleries over the years, they started to become suspicious. So he started to sell by mail order using a long list of pseudonyms. But his style of painting became recognizable. It's the Dahori on the left and a genuine Matisse in the Tate owns on the right. And the FBI was searching for him more actively. He formed an association with an art dealer who was in on the forgery, but it ended in disaster. He got depressed. He overdosed on sleeping pills, but was rushed to hospital and his life was saved. But by this stage, he was wanted in France, Switzerland, Italy, Germany, Great Britain, Mexico, the United States, and Canada for a wide range of crimes: theft, fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and so on. And by 1964, when he was 58, he got fed up with fleeing around the world. His painting started to suffer from all of this stress and strain. People began to recognize his forgeries. Interpol was alerted. He fled to Australia for a year. Then he got tired of living in exile and returned to his house in Ibiza. And there he was arrested, believe it or not, for being a homosexual and spent 2 months in prison. He was never charged with forgery in Spain, as they couldn't prove he'd ever painted a forgery in that country on Spanish soil. But by then he was getting quite famous, and he met Clifford Irving, the novelist, who wrote a biography, Fake, the story of Elmire Dahori, the greatest art forger of our time. Because of the biography, he appeared on television and then was featured in an Orson Welles documentary called F for Fake, 1973. He was living in Spain, remember, and there was no, at the time, there was no extradition treaty between Spain and France. So he was relatively safe, but the French were trying to extradite him, and he heard from a friend that the extradition was about to be granted. So he took an overdose of sleeping pills, and this time he died on the way to hospital. So he was never actually arrested and tried for forgery. He didn't make much money selling his own work, as I said, like a lot of forgers, but as it happens, after his death, because he was so famous by then, a market developed for the Elmires, as they're called. And they started to sell for quite a bit of money. And as the curator of the Fake exhibition at the British Museum said, he made a very significant comment, I think. It's the misfortune of fakes that they are almost always defined by what they are not, instead of being valued for what they are. I think he could claim to be the world's greatest forger because of the volume of his work and the range of countries he operated in, and his sheer chutzpah or audacity, the way he conducted his life. So let's move on to Tom Keating. British artist, came from a poor family. He started out as a house painter, like his father. His father was a house painter, so he went into the same trade. Wasn't very well paid, but it made a living. After the Second World War, he went to art college and became an art restorer. He was also painting his own work and tried to sell it, but he couldn't sell his own work, so he had to make money because art restoring is he was a sort of an on-off career. He didn't have a full-time job, so he worked again as a house painter to make money. But then he met an art restorer called Fred Roberts, who was less ethical than the other restorers, and he started restoring work for Fred Roberts. And some of the work, Fred Roberts asked him to add details to the painting, which he did. And then Keating criticised one of the British artists that he was restoring, Frank Moss Bennett, a 19th, 20th century artist. And Roberts challenged him to paint something better. Okay, if you're criticising Bennett, you do something better. And what Keating did is he painted something in the style of Bennett, and he was so pleased with it that he signed his own name, Keating, on the bottom of the painting. But unknown to him, Roberts removed his signature and changed it to Bennett's signature and sold it. Then, when Keating found out, he chose to say nothing, and Roberts asked him to paint other copies of other artists, which he did. And so the two started to operate together, making forgeries, and Roberts, the art restorer who had better connections, selling them. And Keating started an art class to teach youngsters and met 16-year-old Jane Kelly. This was when Keating was 46. They became lovers, and she became closely associated with him. He told her about the business, and she started to help him sell the forgeries. And the artist he loved most, and not the only artist he copied, but the one he specialized in, was Samuel Palmer. It's the Keating is on the right and the genuine Samuel Palmer on the left. In fact, the one on the left, as it says, sold for $2 million at Sotheby's in 2018. Now, Keating went further than other forgers. He considered himself to be, or he was, a socialist. And using forgery, he wanted to use forgery to disrupt the whole art market because he believed it was corrupt. And he saw critics and dealers lining their own pockets at the expense of naive collectors and impoverished artists. So he wanted to blow up the whole art market, so to speak, by painting so many forgeries that the market would be undermined. No one would know what was real and what was fake. But he also added what he called time bombs to his work, which were bold or crude statements that he painted in lead white underneath the painted surface of the painting. So if you x-rayed the painting, these words would jump out at you because lead white is opaque to x-rays. He also sometimes added anachronisms, like something that hadn't been invented yet. He would paint into one of his paintings. He also used modern pigments deliberately, and many modern copyists use similar methods to avoid accusations of forgery. And he even went further. He sometimes added a layer of glycerine under the paint. So when it was eventually cleaned, which inevitably it would be at some stage, the glycerine would dissolve and the paint layer would disintegrate. That's why he called them time bombs. Now, art dealers were fooled by these imitations, and the forgeries went largely unnoticed through the 60s into the 70s until in 1976, an auctioneer noticed he was selling 13 Samuel Palmers depicting the same theme. And this is an example of a fake Samuel Palmer. And by the way, I thought I'd show you, this is a genuine Palmer. Now, the auctioneer's discovery led one of the journalists on the Times, Geraldine Norman, to investigate what she thought could be an interesting story. She had the paintings tested scientifically and found immediately that they were fake, and published an article in the Times explaining this. She didn't know who the artist was, but she was later informed that the artist was Keating. So she found out where he lived and visited him at home, where he talked openly about his work as a restorer and ranted about the corruption in the art market. He hadn't admitted he was a forger, but with the evidence she had, she wrote another article in the Times about Keating, alleging he was a forger. And he replied not by suing the Times, but by agreeing. He said, "I do not deny these allegations. In fact, I openly confess to having done them." And he wasn't resentful of her exposing him, as he felt that she respected him as an artist, which for him was the most important thing. And at a news conference the same year, 1976, he declared that he'd painted over 2,000 forgeries which were in circulation in the market, including French Impressionists, which I'll show you in a moment, John Constable and many others, but he refused to list them as he wanted to undermine the market. Now, he and Kelly had by then divorced, but they were both arrested as she was aware of the forgeries and tried. She pleaded guilty, but he argued he was innocent because he never intended to defraud. He was then badly injured in a motorcycle accident. He contracted bronchitis, he had a heart condition, and doctors in the hospital believed he would die. And so at that point, charges were dropped against him. Kelly was found guilty and sent to prison. But shortly after the charges were dropped, Keating's health improved. And in fact, he was asked to appear on television shows explaining how to paint like an old master. And he painted in the style of many old masters: Boucher, Degas, Fragonard, Gainsborough, Modigliani, Rembrandt, Renoir, and many others, such as this Monet here. And the reason I haven't put the titles on is you've probably seen this before. It's quite a well-known Monet painting. It's called Poppyfield, but I just wondered whether you could remember which one was by Monet and which one was by Keating. Well, I'll let you know. The Keating's on the right, as you probably worked out. Monet painted the one on the left in 1873 when he was living in Argenteuil, and it was exhibited at the first Impressionist exhibition of 1874. The woman in it, by the way, and the boy are probably his wife Camille and their son Jean. And as you'll notice in the Monet, the way he's structured the painting, there's a strong diagonal linking the two figure groups with a line of poppies. The large foreground area and the relatively small figures creates this impression of openness. But on the other hand, this large foreground area creates a potentially weak, empty foreground, and he avoids that with the trees on the horizon and the strong diagonal linking it together. And in my view, I mean, you might disagree, you might prefer the Keating, but in my view, the Keating has got a weaker sky with less believable clouds. And I think the house on the horizon intrudes too much. You notice that Monet has pushed it back with the tone of the picture. And I think in the Keating, the overly bright grass and poppies swamps the figures too much. And here's another Keating, a fake Degas, that sold at auction recently for £380 as a work by Keating, which the problem is these days, it's difficult to know whether you're buying a Keating, a genuine Keating, if I can put it that way, or a fake Keating. The price suggests that this actually is a fake Keating. He became well known. He published his biography. He appeared on television, and the public warmed to him on television. He became a lovable old rogue. And as I said, he did suffer from lung problems. It was a genuine. Well, he had a motorcycle accident, and the years of breathing in the chemicals used in art restoration led to the bronchitis, and it eventually killed him in 1984 when he was just 66. But he's one of these forgers who, during his lifetime, art collectors, including the ex-heavyweight boxing champion Henry Cooper, collected Keating's work as Keating under his own name. And after his death, Keating's work became increasingly valuable and collectible. And typically his work sells for tens of thousands of pounds today, which is why a market has developed in fake Keatings, which possibly this one is, I don't know. He could be seen as the greatest forger of all time because of the volume of his work, 2,000 forgeries or more by 100, and he forged over 100 different artists. And also perhaps the fact that he was collected in his lifetime for his own work. And by the way, he met and worked with another forger, Max Brandrett, that we'll be talking about later. This is a portrait of the forger and British painter that I'll be talking about next, Eric Hebborn. It's painted by Peter Greenham. Now, Hebborn, I should mention now, Eric Hebborn is probably best known for the manner of his death. He was the artist who in 1996 was found lying in a street in Rome where his skull had been crushed with a blunt instrument, and he died 3 days later in hospital. He was born in Kensington, West London, and it's said his mother beat him constantly as a child, and when he was 8, he set fire to his school and was sent to a reformatory school. Although it needs to be said his sister denies this, that any of this happened. But he did go to reformatory, and it was there that they encouraged his painting, and he first exhibited his work when he was 15. He became a student at the Royal Academy School of Art, and it was there that Peter Greenham painted this portrait, because Peter Greenham was one of the teachers at the Royal Academy, and Hebborn was a star pupil. This painting was in fact the diploma work that Greenham used when he was elected as Royal Academician. But at the Royal Academy, Hebborn won many significant prizes, including perhaps the most prestigious, a 2-year scholarship to the British School in Rome. And when he went to Rome, he met many international artists and dealers, including the British art historian and Soviet spy, Sir Anthony Blunt. And it was Blunt who told him that 2 of his drawings looked like Poussin's. And this, I think, sowed the seeds of his forgery career. It started him thinking, because he found that even though he was a Royal Academy prize winner, he couldn't sell his work, and he became bitter. and he thought the experts were incompetent, and he set out to undermine what he thought was a corrupt market. Let me show you him a brief extract from a documentary made about him.
The dealer is not interested in art. He's interested in, well, basically in money. But a work of art is as good or bad as the price it fetches. The historian is not really very interested in art. I mean, he studies it, but he's much more interested in his career, whether he's going to go up in the, whether he's going to become the head of some great museum. This is what he's really interested in, and whether he can get a knighthood because he knows a lot about Rembrandt, But no one would have ever given Rembrandt a knighthood for being Rembrandt. It's all false values, and art is neglected. Nobody is studying it really and truly with the kind of honesty that is necessary. And although I can't myself claim to be a very honest man, in fact, many people think I'm an old crook, I do feel that in this case, at least, that I am honest. I mean, I do try to understand something about art.
You can hear, I think, there how bitter he is. And just to pick up one point he made, Rembrandt would never have been given a knighthood. Well, obviously he wouldn't have been given a knighthood in Holland, but in Britain, many artists have been knighted, as I think Hebel knew. Sir Anthony van Dyck, Sir Godfrey Kneller, Sir James Thornhill, Joshua Reynolds, Thomas Lawrence, David Wilkie, Edwin Landseer, Lawrence Alma Tadema, and just this year, Sir John Alcomfre and Sir Grayson Perry. But let's move on to some of the how he approached forgery. I think is interesting. On the left, we see a genuine Van Dyck in the Prado, but in the middle, we see a genuine sketch, a preparatory drawing in pen and ink in the British Museum that Van Dyck made in preparation for the painting. And what Hebel has done is he's created a similar but more sketchy sketch, a preliminary sketch on the right. And dealers would have known about the Van Dyck work in the Prado and the sketch at the British Museum. And so he's sort of seduced or fooled the dealers into thinking, well, it's in a similar style, it's more sketchy, but maybe Van Dyck did do the work on the right as a preliminary sketch. So he played to the thinking of and tied it in with other genuine work. He decided to settle in Rome with his lover Graham Smith, and they opened a gallery together in Rome. And he produced many forgeries in the style of old masters, Mantegna, Poussin, Tiepolo, Rubens, Jan Bruegel, and so on. And arts experts declared his paintings authentic. It wasn't just drawings, it was paintings as well. And they sold for tens of thousands of pounds throughout art auction houses, including Christie's and Sotheby's. And a lot of the works he created weren't copies, they were new subjects like here, or variations drawn or painted in the style of the old master. I'll give you another example. Here's Hebel in the style of Claude Lorraine, and I've put up a genuine Claude in the National Gallery on the left. Now, how did he get caught? Well, and a very observant curator at the National Gallery of Art in Washington in 1978 noticed that two drawings by different artists that he had bought from a well-known art dealer, Colnaghi, were drawn on exactly the same paper. And then another work on exactly the same paper was discovered. So there were three that were tracked back to Hebel. Now, Colnaghi didn't go public on this, well, at least not for 18 months. And then even then they didn't name him. Why? Well, one well-known author on fakes and forgeries, Alice Beckett, has said, quote, "No one talks about him. The trouble is, he's too good." So what she means is they were making too much money from him, but he changed his style slightly, but he continued to create at least 500 more drawings between 1978, when he should have been discovered, and 1988. And it was in 1984 that he announced in the press, he publicly announced that he'd forged many works, because he said that he'd done nothing wrong. And in his autobiography, Drawn to Trouble, he criticized the art world and denigrated the so-called experts that he thought were too eager to go along with his crime, almost, if you like, in the back of their minds, knowing that they were forgeries. So he was unapologetic, and following his untimely death, he had written but never published, a forger's manual, which he intended to publish. And after his untimely death, it was published, and it's known as the Art Forger's Handbook. And it's one of the best books written about how to forge works of art. Now, on his death, and his death occurred shortly after the publication of the Italian version of his autobiography, Drawn to Trouble. He was found lying in a street in Rome with massive head injuries, as I said. An investigation much later in 2015 by The Guardian found he had links to the mafia. And also they found that after his death, a few hours after his death, his flat was ransacked as if someone was looking for something. Now, his death was never investigated by the police in Rome, and they put it down to him tripping up and hitting his head on the curb. So the case rests. The Guardian described him as the greatest forger of modern times, and he seems to have amassed a larger fortune than most, and his work his forgeries continue to sell at auction. One last, taken from his book, The Art Forger's Handbook, he gives a little test, which is quite amusing. He offers a challenge to art experts, a side-by-side comparison of his forgery of the portrait of Henri Leroy by Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot in the Fogg Art Museum, Harvard University. One of these is the authentic drawing. One of these is genuine. One of these is by Hebborn. Which is which? And in the book, he says, seek the hesitant line of the copyist as opposed to the strong, sure line of Corot. He then identifies the one on the right as the original and adds, how poor my version is, how faulty the construction, how harsh the modelling, and all sorts of ghastly errors which escaped your notice before. And he then suggests in the book that you, the reader, look at the original in the Fogg Museum. And that this is where he has the last laugh on the experts, because if you do look at the original in the Fogg Museum, you'll find, in fact, the original is the one on the left. And it's the copy by Hebborn is the one on the right. Sorry to fool you briefly, or maybe you guessed. John Myatt, a British artist who carried out what has been called the biggest art fraud of the 20th century. It's always the greatest or the biggest. Now, he was born the son of a farmer, attended art school where he found he could paint in the style of other artists, which he did for amusement. And he became a songwriter briefly and a teacher, an art teacher, until he was 40, when his wife left him, and she left him to look after his children. So he had to give up teaching, and he tried to make a living painting in the style of well-known artists, and he did it openly. He advertised what he called genuine fakes in Private Eye, which he sold for £150. In other words, a legitimate business, copying the old masters. But he didn't realize how good he was. One of his customers, John Drew, bought Myatt's work and then sold it on as if it was genuine. And one was bought by and sold by Christie's for £25,000 as a genuine Albert Glaise. And Myatt then became an accomplice, he found out, and continued to paint works in the style of many artists, Marc Chagall, Jean Dubuffet, Alberto Giacometti, Matisse, Ben Nicholson, Graham Sutherland, and so on. And the police estimated it painted around 200 forgeries, which were delivered to John Drew on a regular basis, and they sold in auction houses in London, Paris, and New York, and only 60 have been recovered. So there's still over 100 still in circulation. This is a painting in the style of the Cubist painter Albert Glaise, and it was thought to be the real deal, as I said, and sold by Christie's. And it was the first forgery that he'd painted, and it was part of what Scotland Yard described as the biggest art fraud of the 20th century. You might be wondering what gave him away. Well, it was sort of unexpected in a way. The art dealer who was in on it, running it, started it, was John Drew, and he made millions selling fake Myatts. And when he divorced his wife, she went through the house, I think probably looking for evidence of how much he was worth, and she found incriminating documents that a lot of them were forgeries, and exposed the whole operation. So he was arrested in 1995, John Myatt, and he argued that all of his paintings, there's an example here of a forged Monet, all of the paintings, he used emulsion paint and KY jelly to ensure they dried quickly, and so they would be trivially easy to spot as copies. He estimated it made £275,000 and offered to pay it back, and offered to help convict Drew, who he'd come to dislike at this stage. However, the sale value of his forgeries was over 25 million euros. So what happened was the police raided Drew's gallery, which was in Reigate in Surrey, found many forged documents that he'd used to authenticate Myatt's paintings, like old gallery stickers, fake provenance, and so on. And Drew even went on to donate £25,000 to the Tate. And as a established, generous philanthropist, he gained access to the British Art Archives, and he used that access to create false authentication for the forgeries, which he put in the archives, so that when anyone checked, they would find what they thought was genuine, incontrovertible evidence that it was a genuine painting. Now, Myatt was sentenced to a year in prison, and he's actually released after 4 months. And Drew, who the court regarded as the mastermind, received 6 years, although he was released after 2 years. And after his release, Myatt continued to paint portraits and genuine fakes, which have become popular amongst collectors, particularly his Monets and his Vincent van Goghs. And this is one of his original fakes that sold for £10,000. Incidentally, the frame is also fake. It's a molded copy of an original wooden frame by Thomas Chippendale. And then finally, on how he made himself, or how he made a name for himself. in 2020, it was announced a film was being made about it called Genuine Fakes. I don't think it's been released yet. He also had a television show called Fame in the Frame on Sky Arts, where he painted a famous celebrity in the style of a famous artist. And most forgers describe forging as a technical skill, but Myatt claims that he could get inside the mind of the great artists and paint with their inspiration. So this is John Myatt's portrait of James May in the style of Roy Lichtenstein. And what I've done here is I'm showing you a still from series 1, episode 2 of the Sky Arts program. So apologies for the quality, but I thought it was worth showing the sort of paintings he would do on the television program. I guess he could also claim to be the greatest forger because of the Scotland Yard description of the biggest art fraud of the 20th century. And also, if you watch the program, he comes across as a very friendly, sincere and likable person. and it just happens that he looks like a good friend of mine as well. My final forger for this talk describes himself as Britain's #1 art forger, Max Brandrett. Born in Brighton, drew cartoon characters as a child. His father left home and his mother couldn't provide for the family. So when he was 5, he and his older brother were taken into care in Dr. Bernardo's children's home, where they encouraged his art. They gave him the materials he needed. He left the home when he was 15 and joined a circus, Chipperfield's first of all, as an elephant handler, then Bertram Mills Circus. He moved to London, made money busking, sold a few paintings that he'd painted himself, not forgeries, slept rough, worked in Lyons Bakery, travelled around holiday camps as an employee. And he was then asked to paint a portrait of the Cray twins' mother. Now, I don't know whether you know, some of you might not know, the Cray twins were gangsters in London at the time, involved in murder, armed robbery, arson, protection rackets, gambling, and so on. So Brandrett was extremely worried about whether he would survive and how it would be received. He obviously had to paint it, but as it turned out, the twins were very happy with the portrait of their mother and paid him £200. And it was at this point that he realized that he could paint in the style of other artists and started to sell forgeries that he'd artificially aged to art dealers. This pair actually gave me some trouble because there's some sites that seem to mix up the genuine and the fake, and they're easily confused. The one on the left is the genuine L.S. Lowry, sold at Christie's for £146,000 in 2013. And on the genuine one, on the attached to the back of the frame, is a letter of authentication from Mervyn Levy, who was a friend of Lowry, and in fact wrote his catalogue raisonné. I guess letters of authentication can be faked as well. It gets very complex, but notice that the genuine Lowry is not signed, but the forgery is signed. And Lowry, in fact, is one of the artists who's frequently forged, and Max Brandrett painted many such forgeries. How did he convince the galleries? Well, his method, he met a businessman called Sam Cohen, and the two of them posed as father and son who didn't know anything about art, but were engaged in clearing houses. They went around the country, they said, clearing out houses. And this was a cover story that enabled them to go into auction houses like Sotheby's and Christie's and explain where the old paintings came from. And what they would do is they would have a whole pile of old paintings that they said they'd got from the house, and they'd put the one that they knew the auction house would be interested in the middle of the pile. and all the rest would be rubbish works by unknown artists. And of course, the auction house would go through and then come across something they would be interested in, and then they'd call in an expert. The father and son would, or quotes father and son, would express complete ignorance and sell it to the gallery. And because they said they were touring the country, that explains how they could keep coming across these works on a frequent basis. So they were able to fool many this way, and they had a fairly lavish lifestyle at this time, but they were he was the sort of person that would spend everything he earned. And then when his marriage broke up, he started to attract the attention of the police. He therefore couldn't sell his work, and he unwisely stole a clock and a chandelier, of all things, from a hotel early one morning, but was caught by the police and sentenced to 6 months imprisonment for the theft. He served 3 months, went back to live with his mother, returned to London, and then started to supply the well-established forger Tom Keating, who I talked about before. And in fact, I mentioned that the relationship with Max Brandrett. Now, Max Brandrett was eventually caught and sent to prison. In prison, he taught his fellow prisoners how to paint, and he continued to paint forgeries himself, which he smuggled out of prison. I don't know how, and he sold them on his release. And the photograph on the left shows a painting that he did, which is a copy of the Caravaggio. The genuine is on the right. And he is shown here in the photograph staging an exhibition of his fake work in 2018. And they're no longer forgeries. He's not intending to deceive anyone. He's selling them as his own work. And whereas a genuine Caravaggio, like the one on the right, might sell for, I don't know, 200 million or more, you can buy an almost identical Brandrett Caravaggio for £2,500, this one up here. And it was at this point, or a bit before this, that he gave up forgery. It was when his mother was ill and dying, and he looked after her, decided to give up forgery, started to sell Brandrett originals. He did a lot of horse racing paintings and produced prints that he sold at race courses. He became an active member of the Variety Club. He donated pictures which they knew were his, helped raise money for charity, held art classes, and he went legit. And now forgers are now forging him. And he said, amusingly, you have to watch out for these forgers, he said. He has said that he'll never do it again. He says, it's ironic to think I spent 3 years in prison for selling fake paintings, and now people are coming to marvel at my work. So he's selling his work successfully. And when asked whether he'd do it again, he said, you have to remember that there were hard times 35 years ago, and I did what I had to do, but I wouldn't do it again now. I think now I'm just looking for respect for the skill involved in what I do. And he's published a biography. It was written by Anthony Valentine, and it's called Britain's #1 Art Forger, The Life of a Cheeky Faker. And he does warn in the book, there are so many Lowrys and impressionist fakes floating around. You can pick up a good Van Gogh for a few quid abroad. And that's how I'll end, I think, reinforcing Max Brandrett's sentiment: beware of fakes and forgeries. You'll now recognize this work is not by Henri Matisse, but by the Hungarian artist Elmir Dahori. Forgeries are everywhere, and it's easy to be fooled. So my advice is only buy paintings you like, and only buy paintings you can afford. And that brings us to the end of part 1. And part 2, I'll cover 6 more recent forgers all of whom claim to be the greatest forgers of the 20th century. We shall see. For now, thank you for your time and your attention.